Welcome to Modern Art Blitz. I'm your host, Matt Gleason. We're broadcasting live from the floor of the LA Art Show, the 2018 edition, the 23rd edition. And my guest right now is a legend in high and low art, Robert Williams. Robert, welcome to Modern Art Blitz.
Well, thank you, Matt. I don't know about that heavy introduction, but I'll take what I can get.
Take what you can get. Well,
yeah.
Now you are here at the art show. There's a lot of stuff going on. There's Little Topia, Juxtapose has a bar. You're looked on as the forefather of a lot of this art.
Well, that's kind of you. That's kind of you. But I walk around here, and there's some of the richest visual imagery in this place. It's well worth coming down and seeing this stuff.
Come on down to the fair.
Yeah. Do you have some questions for me?
I've got some questions for you. Do you consider yourself the forefather of the Little Topia movement? Some people call it lowbrow. Grandfather, forefather.
I'd like to answer a lot of your questions, but I don't want to violate my humility. I'm probably been at this longer than anyone else. I've been an alternative and underground painter probably longer than anyone else I know from the early '60s.
And in that time, I mean, I don't want to say the art world to imply an establishment, but the fine art audience has somewhat come to embrace you, yeah?
Well, I have a place in the fine arts world, in the academic art world. How much they embrace me, I don't know. The vast majority of them do know about me. So I do have a footing in the international art world. I did come up through the feral art world, through hot rod art and underground comics and whatnot. But I do have a formal art education. So
you studied art and a lot of self-taught too, right?
Well, yeah, I seriously started getting into art school in 1963 at Los Angeles City College, and then I went over to Chenard's for a while. The 60s, the beginning of the 60s was totally absorbed with abstract expressionism, so representational art was very untasteful. It was, I don't know how to phrase it. It was kind of frowned on. It wasn't openly frowned on, but anyone that attempted to be a tight renderer in the fine arts world was referred to as an illustrator. So that was kind of a rude way to say, buddy, you're on the wrong track.
And so it was frowned upon. Did you ever capitulate? Did you ever try to make an abstract painting?
Well, sure.
Oh, okay.
I went to art school. That's what they were painting.
Okay. But at some point you just weren't satisfied?
Well, no, there was no resolution in the artwork, and the artwork would not talk, and it had no dialogue in the work, And I'm a big fan of abstract expressionism, but it totally dominated the art world that I was in as a young man.
Almost smothered everything else.
Yeah, and then as the '60s turned into the '70s, there was always a smattering of pop art in there, but pop art, granted, was realism, but it was appropriation art, so you couldn't be overly expressive with pop art. Then conceptualism came in, and minimalism, and there a little while there was some recognition of psychedelic art, but not much. And one of the offshoots of that was op art. And I'd rode the tide on all these different forms of art, and I just kept pecking away as a realist. So.
Now, your breakthrough painting, as far as in your lineage, was in the land of retinal delights.
Yes, sir. It
1967, 68?
Yeah.
And it took you about a year to paint that?
Well, I started in 66 and finished it in 68.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it took a while, and that really was... it's an LSD trip painting from the perspective of the person on the LSD trip.
Well, when you look at the painting, it does reveal itself to show that the painter was a psychedelic cavalier that painted it. So there was an enormous amount of abstract three-dimensional items in there that would draw in an investigative imagination to kind of feel your way through the painting.
Well, now, unlike pop art, not a single object in there is referential of a pop culture item. Those are all.
That's right.
You came up with them on your own.
Yes, sir. That's exactly
Okay.
right. That's exactly right.
So you've been a strong proponent of the imagination, correct?
Yes, I see imagination as a very, very important factor in art. It's downplayed, and it's been downplayed for 50 years. It's the New York School of International Art stresses sophistication, and sophistication can certainly be observed as a language in abstract expressionism. Abstract expressionism cannot be beat for interior decorating. It is the premier form of art that lends itself to modern architecture. So you cannot beat abstract expressionism, but you can really enjoy abstract expressionism viewing it peripherally.
Just as part of a scene.
As part of a scene, yeah. And I was a big fan of a lot of abstract expressionists, de Kooning and whatnot, but I didn't. I had itchy hands, and I wanted to show off my abilities, and my lesser character came out in my work to really noodle down, and this was primarily because I was raised on comic books and hot rod art and girly magazines and sideshow banners and all these things that were considered outre in the fine arts world that I always thought had an enormous amount of vitality and energy.
Well, in addition to what we call fine art, you were also an underground cartoonist.
Absolutely.
One of the first and certainly foremost.
Well, I came into Zap Comics 68 or 69 with Robert Crumb. Rick Griffin was also in it with me. Now, I'm the first underground comic book artist in Los Angeles, but I'm not the first underground cartoonist. I could give that credit to Ron Cobb and a few people that were working for the Free Press back there in the 60s.
And you differentiate the two.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Underground.
yeah. An underground cartoonist comes up with stories, and then there's a sequential pattern of panels. An underground cartoonist generally does editorial material.
Okay.
Okay.
So there's two things. I mean, but they're certainly drawing from the same, like,
that's right.
anti-establishment,
That's right. Yeah.
And a
Yeah.
preference for what you say is illustration.
Yeah. Underground comics were a situation that evolved out of the drug cultures prior to the Vietnam War, and then the underground comics come out during the Vietnam War. And there were, let me preface this. In the 1950s, 54, there was a subcommittee investigation linking funny books, comic books, with juvenile delinquency. So they de facto outlawed a lot of the very best comic books. So as a kid, I remember seeing the comics that I really liked were just taken off the stands, and it just kind of, as a little kid, kind of like PO'd me, So then when I got into underground comics, all my contemporaries in underground comics experienced the same thing. So we said, well, you think those comics was something. You think those were disturbing. Well, we'll show you what disturbing is.
Uh-oh.
So we got in with Zap Comics, and Zap was really a wonderful form of expression because it just was wide open imagination. You couldn't get far enough out. And we were trying to seek an intelligent, arcane audience. We weren't trying to throw a broad blanket and catch as many people as we could. But inadvertently, it did attract an enormous audience across the United States and Europe. And consequently, some of those issues of Zap Comics sold well over 1 million. And they
collectibles from the original press.
Yeah. I mean, they changed humor in America. They affected the movie industry. They affected comedians. They were an enormous reference point for people that was in the media to see what was going on in Zap Comics, because it was a pilot medium. Anyway, consequently, the law really came down on Zap Comics and all the rest of the underground comics. I think with Zap alone, more than 400 news dealers did go to jail. See.
Wow.
So anyway, for me, the next step, as I was already a painter, was to take that language into graphics and put it up into actually challenge the fine arts world and see if this material would float face to face with the fine arts world. So then I got into a lot of trouble, and the proof of that pudding was how deep I got in hot water at Helter Skelter show.
Helter Skelter was the 1990 91 curation by
1992. Came out in 92. Yeah.
The curation by Paul Schimmel
Right.
at the Museum of Contemporary Art at the building that now called the Geffen Contemporary.
Yeah.
And it featured about 15 to 20,
16
Los Angeles artists, and it really announced that Los Angeles had its own center in the art world, independent from New York. But it also brought back a lot of realist kind of approaches, or non. It was basically the death of any just bland conceptual.
Well,
and
yeah,
abstract.
that was a landmark show, and I got an enormous amount of trouble about that too, and was censured by a lot of people, especially the academic art world in Los Angeles and later in New York. But the phenomenon about that show that it was in over 150 newspapers. It was critiqued in an enormous amount of newspapers. And they all give it a negative run. They all criticize it, except for the Washington Post said it was a wonderful experience going in there because it was like walking through a Zap comic. And
high praise.
Yeah, I think so too. When all was said and done, I don't think any art critic ever noticed this was the first major art show in the history of the United States where the very bulk and the majority of the material on the walls at the Helter Skelter show were cartoon related. Some way they were cartoon related. Most
they had like an animation.
There was a
foundation.
turning point there that nobody noticed because the stuff was just too disturbing to people. So
it was for its time. It was a pretty edgy show. I think maybe we've caught up to some of it, not necessarily all of it. The robots humping the trees and some of your wilder images.
Well, I faced a lot of problems with the feminist movement, saw a lot of violations of their social mores, and so I think this Helter Skelter scared a lot of people to watch out what they did, because I had coming out of Zap Comics, those paintings at Helter Skelter show had a lot of gratuitous sex and violence in it, see, so this was a demarcation in what's going to be shown in L.A.
Always popular subjects.
Yeah.
So around that time, you founded, you got started a magazine, Juxtapose, and we're going to get to that. We're going to take a little break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about beginning and the triumph of Juxtapose over the normal art world art magazines. We'll be back 2 minutes for a word from our sponsor here at the LA Art Show right after this.